So thank you, everybody, for being with us. Again, we're the Center for Migration Studies of New York. We're a think tank and an educational institute, and on our good days, we like to call ourselves a think and do tank, so maybe this is a good day. What I'm going to do is I'm going to provide a brief summary of the policy context for our gathering, and then I'm going to introduce Bishop Stowe, who's with us today. But let me start, first of all, by acknowledging and thanking our partner agencies in organizing this event. And they are the Advocates for Basic Legal Equality, or ABLE, of Ohio, Catholic Charities of the Diocese of Cleveland, Cincinnati Compass, Faith in Indiana, the Immigrant and Refugee Law Center here in Cincinnati, Intercommunity Justice and Peace Center in Cincinnati, La Casa de Amistad in South Bend, Indiana, the Legal Aid Society of Southwest Ohio, the Metropolitan Area Religious Coalition of Cincinnati, the National Immigrant Justice Center, which is centered in Chicago but has an office in Goshen, Indiana, Ohio Legal Assistance Foundation in Columbus, Refugee Connect here in Cincinnati, the Sisters of Charity of Cincinnati, and the Interfaith Coalition of Immigrant Justice in Lexington. I wanted to thank, too, the Lang Law Office for arranging the trip to the Butler Jail yesterday, which was very interesting and eye-opening. And then the Cincinnati Interfaith Worker Center for hosting us yesterday afternoon, and of course to Xavier University and to President Graham here for hosting us these 2-3 days. Special thanks too to the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which has supported this event, and to Andrew Garrity of Carnegie, who's here with us today. And of course, thanks to my CMS colleagues, particularly Rachel Reyes, who organizes all of these events for us, and to Daniela Alulema and to Amy Chen for their work in organizing the event. We always work with a lot of partner agencies at CMS, but this is actually just our second, what we call whole of community events. Our first was last summer in Houston. And the idea for these kinds of events arose from a study that we did on implementation of the DACA program nationwide. And we came away from that study highly impressed with the community response to DACA around the country, and concluded that this was not just due to a frantic few months of work, but to years actually of building institutional capacity, strategic partnerships, advocacy voice, and expertise in diverse areas. And that capacity building really took many forms, including effective partnerships. And we came to call that kind of model the whole of community approach to these challenges. Of course, this kind of approach is particularly important in the current policy and political context. You need all the gifts and contributions and goodwill and strategies and tactics of a community to prevail in the kind of atmosphere that we find ourselves in. Communities are where these struggles take place and where we can make a collective difference, much more so than, say, in Washington, D.C. these days. This event will seek to lift up what works in the community responses to and with immigrants in Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana, and it's really about how to strengthen these responses. What's the broader policy perspective? Let me just give you the litany. I think much of the federal government and the media coverage that you hear is focused on the harsh border enforcement policies, and those certainly exist, but we hear a lot about the 2,000-mile wall, the executive orders which have kind of paved the way for mass indiscriminate deportations, the criminal prosecution of political asylum seekers, separating children from their parents, and in the alternative that's been proposed, family unity, but family unity and indefinite detention, which is a terrible idea. And now we're seeing the return of large-scale, highly publicized raids, which can be very damaging to communities. Yet just as consequential, I think, have been the attacks on legal migration programs, particularly programs that involve executive action, executive discretion, and not legislation. Remember, it wasn't too long ago, it seems longer, that the Obama administration was attacked as kind of this lawless administration for creating the actual DACA program. And, but really the current administration exercises executive discretion far more aggressively and to the detriment of immigrants and to their communities. It's excelled, it's stripping people of legal status, really illegalizing them is what's been happening, and blocking those who might qualify for status and protection. So let me provide the examples. I mean, the first is the Refugee Resettlement Program, which has resettled 3 million refugees since 1980. It's really the pride and joy of U.S. humanitarian programs. This year, with a record 68 million forcibly displaced people in the world, including 25.4 million refugees, the United States is on a track to resettle only 20,000 people. That would be the lowest number in the program's 38-year history. It sought to terminate the DACA program, which directly affects 700,000 people and, of course, indirectly affects many more. It terminated the Central American Minors Program, which allowed refugee children from Northern Triangle states to migrate legally to the United States to join their legally present parents here in the United States. It terminated the Temporary Protected Status Program for 200,000 Salvadorans, for 57,000 Hondurans, for 50,000 Haitians, and for lesser numbers of Nicaraguans, Sudanese, and Nepalese. It ended the Deferred Enforced Departure Program for 4,000 Liberians. And it's championed, so far unsuccessfully, legislation to limit family visas to the spouses and minor children of U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents. So under that plan, which hasn't passed, parents, adult children, brothers and sisters, and other nuclear family members of citizens or lawful permanent residents, these are often called chain migrants, but really they're nuclear family members. All of these people would no longer qualify for family-based visas. That proposal would cut legal immigration to the United States by 40% alone. It's an administration that claims to favor skilled migration, but it's actually made it more difficult for skilled workers to be admitted than any administration in recent memory. It opposes a diversity visa program, which is mostly available to Africans, people from African nations, and of course it's banned nationals from 8 countries from entering at all, allegedly on security grounds. In addition, it's soon going to issue a rule to redefine who is deemed a likely public charge, and those people will be denied admission and permanent resident status as a result. Up to now, non-citizens who used cash welfare benefits were considered likely to be a public charge. Under this new rule, that's going to cover individuals and their dependent family members, including their U.S. citizen children, who have received an array of non-cash benefits as well, a very broad array, things like food stamps and child health insurance and the Earned Income Tax Credit. That rule is going to cause many parents, of course, to pull their children out of basic benefit programs that are essential to their well-being. We know that that's going to happen. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services also recently adopted a policy to issue notices of appear, which are what trigger removal proceedings, to persons whose immigration applications and petitions have been denied, leaving them undocumented. That's certainly also going to operate as a disincentive for people to come forward to legalize their status for a status that a visa for which they might be eligible, for fear that they'll get deported at the end of it. The administration has also proposed to divert some of the fees that immigrants pay for their legal immigration benefits to ICE and to add a surcharge to those fees. That measure is going to block low-income immigrants from filing for immigration benefits and legalizing their status too. And in the midst of all of these measures, DHS has announced the formation of a denaturalization task force, which will certainly create more fear in immigrant communities, so taking citizens and denaturalizing them. This is really the broader context, and it's quite clear that it cries out for a whole of community response. I have a son who's a scientist, and I think of Newton's third law when I think about what the Trump administration is doing these days. And the idea, that law is that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And in this case, there needs to be an opposite and a disproportionate reaction. And the only way we're going to get a disproportionate reaction is if communities throughout the country broadly oppose some of these measures. So to speak to these challenges and needs and hopefully to humanize kind of the battle that we're up against and the challenge that we're up against, we're really, really delighted to have Bishop John Stowe with us. Bishop Stowe was ordained as the Bishop of Lexington, Kentucky, which is a very diverse area, on May 5th, 2015. He previously served as the pastor, the moderator of the Curie, and eventually as chancellor for the Diocese of El Paso. Bishop Stowe has taken to heart Pope Francis's call to go to the peripheries, to encounter migrants and refugees where they are, and to accompany them on their journeys. And he was integral to the Catholic Day of Action on behalf of the Dreamers at the Capitol in February of this year. And his blessing in blessing the participants in that Day of Action, these are the words he used. We stand with the Dreamers, we are one with the Dreamers, and now I ask God's blessing upon those who are acting in civil disobedience, part of a long-standing tradition of not supporting unjust laws. And we're very delighted, and I'd like to introduce him now, Bishop John Stowe.
Thank you, Don. I'm delighted to be with you and to be with a group of passionate and committed people who are gathered to promote just and inclusive communities in our 3 states, especially in this climate of enhanced danger for immigrants and refugees. As the leader of a minority faith community in central and eastern Kentucky, which is what the Catholic Church is there, I have been truly inspired by the grassroots efforts of small groups of people who have learned exactly what it means to love your neighbor and how to exercise the mercy and compassion that Jesus demonstrates throughout his earthly ministry. In some of our small rural communities, people of faith were horrified to discover that the very people who served them at a local restaurant could disappear overnight into detention or deportation. When given the opportunity, they stepped up. They stepped up to sign power of attorney papers for their neighbors and friends' children in case someday those neighbors and friends are taken away by ICE enforcement. I've also been inspired personally by a pastor in a rural community who now makes it part of his daily routine to bring food and other necessities to an immigrant family whose main breadwinner has been taken into custody, leaving a wife to try to work and raise little children, striving to provide for her family. Now, as much as I'm convinced of the power of the gospel and have my faith confirmed in the goodness of people when I see this kind of practical charity in action, I'm profoundly disturbed that this kind of activity is needed in our nation at this time. The folks who are stepping forward in kindness have discovered that there's a huge difference between really knowing the plight of a neighbor and seeing the real consequences and suffering of children and families, how different that is from hearing fear-inspiring rhetoric from talking heads who speak 24 hours a day about an invasion and about the threats to our safety coming across the border. I believe it's critical for churches and community organizers and all people of goodwill to humanize the issue of immigration, to tell stories and introduce people's real experiences into the public consciousness if we want to bring about real and lasting change in the treatment of immigrants and strangers in our community. When they have a face, a heart, and a real story, it's hard to see them as a threat. At this moment, I think it's important to take stock of where we are. In recent weeks, while we've seen an unimaginable kind of human cruelty, a kind that has lasting repercussions for the vulnerable children involved, being carried out as a matter of public policy, national policy, who would believe that in the land of the free and the home of the brave, we would be so threatened by penniless, shoeless migrants who've traveled hundreds of miles to escape gangs, violence, and brutal poverty? What kind of national security requires the separation of children from their parents? Even as we acknowledge the horror of this reality, which most of us could not have imagined, I don't want to lose sight of what else we have seen. The great outcry, the treks to the border by the influential, the persistence of the media, the leaking of pictures and audio files of the heartrending cries of children separated from their parents, all of which has provoked a reaction that we as Americans, we as a people and a nation don't want to be identified with cruelty, don't want to be identified as a nation that locks up children, that loses vulnerable children in a broken system, that allows children to be warehoused and penned in like livestock behind chain link fences. Even a president who has trained his ears to only hear a certain portion of the population could not be shielded from those outcries. Encountering the human faces and the cries of the victims of unjust immigration enforcement and the organized insistence that these faces be encountered has brought about some relief, and the emphasis has to be on some. Now we must continue to raise those voices and continue to insist that family incarceration is not a solution, and that family incarceration is still the incarceration of children. We can't let up or allow the public to become accustomed to tent cities on military bases, asylum-seekers turned away from our borders, and families with and without children held in detention. Nor do we want to see the families who are escaping violence be sent back to the very places that they risked everything to escape. On the one hand, we should acknowledge gratefully that the outcry of the nation was swift, if not unanimous, and the age of instant communication worked well to place egregious injustice in front of us unrelentingly, and so it provoked a reaction. But the zero-tolerance approach to immigration enforcement is only the latest step in a system that has been broken for decades. Despite our nation's need for immigrant labor, it could really be called an addiction, we don't have the political will to protect the immigrants' human rights, to provide protection in the workplace, to provide a pathway to legal residency, to allow the people who are picking our produce, building our businesses and homes, caring for our children, tending our yards, processing our poultry, and doing the difficult work that many Americans will not do and do not envision their children doing. We won't allow these decent and hardworking people to participate fully in our society. They live in fear of deportation, in fear of raids, in the fear of going to work on any given day. They might be rounded up, and their kids may come home to an empty house with no knowledge of where their parents were taken, as happened in 2 large-scale raids in northern Ohio in the same time period when our attention was focused on the southern border. Even the young who had no say about being brought to this country and who've only known this country as their homeland, who speak only English, who attend our schools, who work, and who strive for a share in the American dream, who have taken the risk of registering with the government, trusting in the promise that they would be protected, now live in fear because we don't have the political will to do what a solid majority of the country supports and protect the dreamers. The dreamers who know the original American dream much better than many of us, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of yesterday's immigrants. Now we must say as a nation that the incarceration of families is still the incarceration of children. We must say that there is a way to protect our borders from criminals, but it won't be found if we spend all of our time and resources prosecuting thousands of families escaping violence in their homelands. We must say that we too were once aliens in a foreign land, and so we will heed the biblical admonition to love the alien as yourself. I hope that his fellow Methodists have shown Jeff Sessions those verses in the Bible, scattered throughout the Old Testament. For the first 15 years of my priesthood, I lived and worked on the U.S.-Mexico border in El Paso, Texas. I was the pastor of a church that was established in 1680, and because of the change of the course of the Rio Grande has been on both sides and even in the middle of that river. I learned to be a pastor from the people on the border where the consequences of global injustice were right in front of our eyes. People standing on one side of the trickle known as the Rio Bravo could look across and see what they make in a whole day as the minimum wage for an hour across the river. I saw the construction of fences and then walls along the border, and simultaneously the mixed message coming from opportunities for employment alluring those seeking a better life. When Ciudad Juarez became one of the most dangerous places on earth, especially for women, the attraction of safety on the other side became even stronger. The growing militarization of the border came with increased violence, too often costing the lives of young people mistaken for criminals. Yet even in those days, the U.S. already had a broken immigration system. A city whose history was binational and multicultural, where passing across the international boundary was a daily reality for many, it became a divided city that reinforced inequality. People from the north could freely go south. People from the south were detained when coming north. NAFTA was introduced, allowing goods to pass freely along the border, across the border, but not the people that make and consume those goods. The cry of the bishops then and now on both sides of the border was that we need comprehensive immigration reform. Providing economic opportunities and safety in the homeland is really the only lasting solution to the problem of immigration. People's right to life, to survival, and to the support of their families is of a much higher moral order than the nation's rights to protect its borders, although border protection is acknowledged as a right of nations. That people who cross borders do not give up their human rights and must be treated humanely, and that immigration policies and quotas need frequent revision to make it possible for those who have a genuine need to migrate to do so legally and safely. It's been our consistent cry that people of faith and people of goodwill must heed the biblical admonition to welcome the stranger and to respond to people in need in ways that respect their dignity. At a recent ecumenical prayer service in Frankfort, the capital of Kentucky, we reflected together on the final judgment scene from Matthew's gospel. And I'm afraid that in our very individualized existence, we in the U.S. failed to hear that in the opening lines of that famous judgment scene, we hear that Christ arrives, throned in glory, surrounded by angels, to judge the nations. It's the nations that are divided like sheep from goats, depending upon their treatment of Christ present in the most needy. I offered there the following application. When I picked and prepared your food, you watched me be handcuffed and loaded into a van. When I grew the plants you used in your yard, you allowed me to be detained far from where I lived and worked. When I served you at table, you didn't know that I went home in fear that I might be stopped along the way or that my spouse wouldn't come home at all. When I ran away from an abusive spouse or protected my kids from gangs on our street, you turned me away from your border. When I was 5 years old and separated from my parents, you accused me of being MS-13 or an actor. When I sat next to you in class, you said, "Go back where you came from," and insulted my accent, my skin color, my way of being. When I was a child and woke up crying for my mom, you didn't comfort me, much less help me find her. When I came to do the work you advertised, you categorized me with rapists and drug dealers. When I tried to call my precious child, you connected me to a bureaucracy with no answers. The Son of Man, coming in glory and surrounded by angels, is seated upon his glorious throne. But that throne is a thin mattress in a tent surrounded by chain link fence. Thank you.